Trove's combat and how you build classes can be broken up into 3 categories. Speed farming, where you're trying to complete dungeons as fast as possible, which means you need to have a class that has a good base movement speed and you will be sacrificing damage for more speed. Delves, which is a combination of damage and health. In most cases, you need to be really tanky to be able to survive the long, drawn-out gauntlet. And Leviathans are all about damage. You don't need to survive if you can kill it before it kills you. The efficiency of a class can basically be broken down into these 3 categories. Some will be stronger than others in one area and weaker in another. Another video of mine that I would recommend is the classes cheat sheet. It's basically a visual graph that kind of shows where each character fits in the spectrum. At the end of it all, I would always recommend that you play the class that you enjoy, rather than picking something specifically because it's efficient. So assuming you've picked out your main, let's get started with the more detailed tutorial. And at long last, we finally get to the Solarion, and this class is one of the strongest single target characters in the game. Like people say Boomeranger hits harder, but nah. Solarion single target is king. Boomeranger is actually a lot better in most cases for long shade and end game, just because it can handle like large groups of enemies, and Solarion does not really strive for that. It does depend though, because if you end up having the crystal ring effect and so on and so forth, the whole thing about this character's kit is damage over time. So you're trying to get all of your special abilities to proc on an enemy at the same time, and it just melts your opponents. Now for a subclass ability, unfortunately, you aren't going to be able to use the Solarion subclass ability because of course it is the Solarion class. So you do have a couple different options. Lunacy does give you the physical damage, which you don't really want, but it also does give you the sort of crazy where your character goes big and does a lot of damage. I've heard tell from a lot of other people that the Bard is a pretty good one just because of that movement speed, because unfortunately this class kind of sucks when it comes to like speed farming. It's more so a boss killer, so you would just pick your poison and try to pick something that you feel is more optimal for you. Knight subclass can be really good just because of the extra flask capacity. The Pirate Captain one is okay. You wouldn't think so just because of how random the naval gunfire like the cannonball is, but it does do a decent amount of damage when or if it connects. As for the stat priority, you would of course go for attack speed no matter what, because that's going to end up giving you more damage overall, because this character, is affected by attack speed and so on. But otherwise you would end up having movement speed. If you absolutely want to use this character for speed farming and such, you're gonna need as much movement speed as you can because this character's movement speed kind of sucks. However, for delves, bosses, and whatever, which is most of all where this class shines, you would end up having crit damage and attack speed instead, just because then it's pretty much as much damage as you can get on your gear. Now for the crystal ring effect, you have the 3 different options, which is guiding flight, so prismatic blast and guiding light. Now also apply the solar wings slow fall effect. Basically just gives you slow fall, that one's useless. Solar stance, this will remove the solar wings effect, now applying a damage reduction buff for a short time. As you know with Trove, damage reduction is irrelevant. And then prismatic chain, this is the crystal ring effect that you will want to go for, where it makes prismatic blast, causes enemies damaged by it to also fire off a prismatic blast of their own, damaging nearby enemies. If you have this ability, then Solarion is extremely competent in fighting large groups of enemies, which is its initial weakness if you don't end up using that. The best banner in slot is of course going to end up being the Leviathan torches, with the perma torches being the best options. I always use Knotted Shadow just as the crafted perma torch, because of course Solarion being a bow character is physical damage, and then on top of that this gives movement speed, which is something that I prioritize on all of my classes. And as I mentioned before, Solarion is innately really slow. As for the best ally in slot, in most cases, that'll end up being Scorpius for speed farming, because of that movement speed boost when a nearby enemy dies. So coming over from the hub, all the way up here in the skill tree, Scorpius is going to end up being all the way up here, which you'll inevitably end up getting anyways because of the light value that you need out of the skill tree anyway. or the mini fire mana beast is, as far as I've heard, the best physical ally in terms of raw damage, because that extra crit damage percentage equals more damage than the extra light that you would end up getting out of Scorpius. Coming from the hub, you would end up going down into the basement instead of up top with the Astrolabe, and you do have to max out the Mystic Arts profession in order to craft this, and then you have to get the mana embers from Lava Worlds. So yeah, kind of sucks. You're going to be flashbanged. As for the stats that you would prioritize in the skill tree, you would go for the Life Leech node first and foremost, because it'll make your characters across the board so much more tanky and have so much more survivability. And then otherwise, I prioritize the movement speed nodes, the light nodes, and of course the damage nodes. As for your best flask and slot, honestly, it's any of these. Just pick whichever you want. Elysian Bandolier is good just because you can spam them while you're fighting bosses. Death Defying is good for normal farming, because if you're at the end game, most enemies will usually get close to one-shotting you, and so Death Defying can really help you out. Conjurer's Crucible is kind of the fan favorite for a lot of people that don't want to use Death Defying, just because if you have the Magic Find, this will allow you to farm for a longer period of time. Yeah, that's kind of it. It's unfortunate that there's so many different flasks and so few options that are actually viable. As for your emblem, Martial Emblem is a must, just because you're gonna need that damage for all of the end game enemies. And then if you're earlier on in the game, you could end up using Sure Strike just to get that crit hit value a little bit higher. And then otherwise, Trailblazing if you're speed farming, Zealous if you're trying to be a boss killer, because you'll notice that the Solarion actually starts with 0 energy and that slowly builds up as you fight enemies and what have you. But if you have Zealous, you can consume a flask, use your ult, which continually drains energy, so you can just keep consuming flasks over and over and have your ult staying for an infinite amount of time. Basically, as long as you have flasks and don't toggle it off, you can just do heaps and heaps of damage. The mid-game stat goal that you're gonna focus on is around 70 to 80,000 physical damage, I guess, somewhere around there. The crit hit, you're gonna wanna try to get to 50 to 60%, just because, again, the way that stat works is once you get to 100%, you have a 100% chance of triggering crits, and then your crit damage would be somewhere around like 800%. Anything higher than that, you're gonna inevitably get as you get closer to the end game, and we'll talk more about that with our gems. But I'm just saying that if you notice one of your stats is kind of really slagging behind, then you would just kind of adjust for that. But it's not as important as you would think until you get kind of further on in the game. Another mandatory piece of advice that I need to mention is to get your classes to level 30 before you even bother checking PR and trying to figure out how to make your character stronger, because as you get to level 30, you'll unlock all of the gem slots, which in turn gives you the highest power boost in terms of both damage and just raw PR. Lastly, before we get into the gems, this is not a video focusing on coefficiency. Each of the classes has a slight nuance in their stats, and so coefficiency builds are very, very specific to the class. I might end up doing some coefficiency guides sometime next year. I don't know. It's not that important to this game unless you're in like a super end game group that's doing really, really deep delves or something like that, because for everything else, there's MasterCard. And what I mean by that is it doesn't really matter for coefficiency's sake. Now I'm gonna swap over to my Shadow Hunter before we get into the gems. We're gonna focus on all the colored gems first, keeping the cosmic gems just tucked away to the side. You don't have to follow these stats to the letter. It's just something as a frame of reference to make it digestible for you guys. So you're gonna have 3 of your lesser gems be 2 boost physical damage, 1 boost crit damage, no boost crit hit. And then the other 3 lesser gems, you would simply swap the 2 boosts off of physical and instead have 2 boost crit damage, 1 boost physical, and no boost crit hit. Again, if there's slight variation between that, it doesn't really make as much of a difference. It's just trying to strike a nice balance between them. As for the empowered colored gems, those are all going to end up unanimously being the same as the first gems, which is 2 boost physical damage, 1 boost crit damage, and no boost to crit hit. Of course, when you get your crit hit to 100%, you can start cycling that off of your gems for more max health to give you a little bit more survivability. And all of your cosmic gems are going to be every boost into light, and then the additional stats being physical damage and crit damage. As for the Empowered Gem abilities, you would go for Prismatic Link. So this makes it so that Prismatic Blast now pulses around the Phoenix as well as the Solarion, allowing the Solarion to maintain range while attacking. More so it's because you can double stack the damage, because it'll end up dealing area of effect damage around your Phoenix as well as you. And then in most cases, I would just go for Pyro Disc no matter what, because that movement speed can be really, really nice while you're out farming. Explosive Epilogue can also be really nice because it is a ranged character. It really does depend if you're trying to build the class to fighting large groups of enemies, because as I mentioned previously, you will have to have your Crystal Ring effect triggered. And then other than that, it's kind of up to you. You could use, well, not Volatile Velocity, that's kind of worthless on him. You could use a Cubic Curtain to keep yourself alive. Sunburst, I think, triggers some sort of area of effect, or maybe it's the Flower one. One of those works really well with the Solarion just because it's more damage over time. And as far as I remember, I didn't test this myself, I just had somebody tell me, it does trigger a lot of your passive damage over time effects on the Solarion, so it can end up being really, really good. Somebody correct me in the comments about that. And then as for your Cosmic Gem, that kind of depends again. In most cases, you would go for Berserk Battler just because that's going to give you more raw damage, and that's where this class shines. But Vampirium would give you the movement speed. It does give you Life Leech as well, but that's pretty irrelevant once you get Life Leech out of the skill tree. And with all of that said, ladies and gentlemen, we are finally done with the definitive class guides. There's a couple things that I would personally criticize about these videos that I started to notice as we got further along in this series, if you want to call it. Namely, I noticed that I kind of took for granted most people understand how these classes work, and so I never really explained the mechanics to the classes, at least early on in the videos. So I tried to rectify that in the most recent ones, which kind of makes sense because these classes are a lot more, they get perpetually more and more complex the further we go along. But either way, I'm insanely happy with how these videos ended up turning out. They are quite uniform, which does make them a bit boring as far as a content creator. I can't really end up inserting myself too much into these guides. It's more so just, okay, follow the letter, here's the checkbox of all the things that I gotta talk about kind of thing. But with all of those finally out of the way, it means that I can finally put this dog to rest, get these thoughts out of my mind towards dreading the next one of these videos to make, and instead focus on some more funner stuff. I've got a huge list of Trove ideas for videos and stuff. It's just, this kind of took all of my energy to do these. I know that seems strange, but to end up having a guide at the quality that I'm expecting and that I want out of myself, it requires a lot of effort. You wouldn't really think so, but to try and have these videos as concise and to the point as possible, on top of that, there's slight nuance to all the classes that I gotta try and remember in all of these videos. But on top of that, it's just insane to edit these. It's pretty boring because they're also uniform. And I'm not necessarily saying it as a complaint or anything. I'm just saying that now that it's finally out of the way, I can take a step back and kind of reevaluate, okay, what's the next set of Trove videos that I want to end up doing, and hopefully have something a little bit more fun. Not to imply that I didn't have fun making these videos, but hopefully I've communicated what I'm trying to communicate. In any case, I would appreciate if you would like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, buy the merch if you want to. It's up to you. I don't know. It is the cheapest that it's ever been before, so yeah, there's that. But otherwise, yeah, I'll see you in the next one.